So that huge 120mm gun that's on the M103 tank, the huge American tank in front of the M60, whopping great big cast turret it's got on it, that's 120mm. The actual 105 that the British had invented had better armour penetration capabilities than that 120mm gun. The STL, that's Defence Scientific and Technical Laboratories, they've lent it to us, and every now and again it goes up on Salisbury Plain to act as an opposition force for British tankers, so it's not all done by simulation. Every now and again you can see a real threat vehicle, as it's now known, looks like. A lot of T-72s all around the place, so again, just as we can see driving around at the moment, we've got a Leopard with its gun reversed. Leopard 1 still out there, still being used by a number of countries, and still lock the guns onto the incoming target, and that radar at the front will keep an eye on the target from out to 13 kilometres away. And it can fire a really interesting array of ammunition, some anti-aircraft, some armour-piercing. They fire something called piercing round. So when it hits the target, the level breaks up and causes more damage to an airframe. So whether it's a helicopter or an incoming jet, it will do an awful lot of damage. But a very impressive bit of kit. The Dutch, when they ordered theirs, they got 95 of them. When they ordered their version, PRTL, the troops called them a pruttel. It means like to stutter, which is what the guns fire. It's got a Dutch radio system and basically a radar system on, so that's a real difference between that and the German Gepard. The Belgians bought it as well, they just used the Gepard, the German version, straight away into service. This particular throttle has come across from this one's in their historic collection. The PRTLs have gone out of service now with the Dutch military. This one wasn't upgraded. A number of them had, like so much modern technology, it gets new upgrades on it. This one didn't get the digitalisation done to it, so it's still in the old kind of analogue format inside there. When the digitised versions came out in the year 2000 into Dutch forces, one of them was photographed from C Company. It had its name Cheetah on the side of the vehicle, and that was published in the Dutch press. Everyone then started calling the vehicle Cheetah, and in the end the Dutch military, instead of trying to say no, it's not Cheetah, it's a PRTL, they gave up the Dutch military. So a really interesting vehicle there again, if you've got the opportunity, but tomorrow now, go and have a closer look and say hello to some of the Dutch crews there that are on top of it. Having a look. Now the next vehicle moving off, PZ61. That's a Swiss vehicle. The Swiss in the 1950s, they were keen to buy Centurion tanks from Britain, but then basically the Korean War kicked off, and they realised it was always a bit dodgy buying tanks elsewhere here. Other people were busy. It's got basically a Mercedes bus engine, very sensible idea, because you could get component parts for this all over the place. And but they've done a cast steel hull, cast turret, and as I mentioned earlier, that British L7 gun you've got there with the 105mm gun, the extraction, fume extractor halfway down the barrel. And if you look at this tank from the front as it drives past you, a little bit narrower than most of the tanks out there, and that was purposely designed for the Swiss scenery. They didn't like the idea of having too wide a tank, sometimes on mountain roads. And the other thing about this vehicle, you can see the driver, he's got his head out the hatch down the front. He's got a very sensitive steering system. And I think I've mentioned before that sometimes the Tiger drivers for our Tiger 1 tank here, when we learn how to drive, they learn on this one. Got very similar, very delicate controls. And again, the whole idea of that, the last thing you want to be doing is missing your, putting the stick too far and disappearing off a mountain road in Switzerland. So that was the idea of making their vehicles adapted for the type of terrain they were going to, they thought they were going to fight in. And so the Swiss PZ61, it went out of service in the 1970s, copied, or upgraded to the PZ68. There was a slightly later model with some variations on it. And the Swiss then did like what so many European countries did, they bought Leopard after they finished with their own tank there. Now that T-72, C-72 tank is, and they managed to do that by getting rid of the loader. If you look at the other tanks, they're a bit higher because they've all got even if it's in two parts, sitting there is a round circular cassette in there with ammunition in. And the whole idea is that moves around, it gets level with the barrel of the T-72, which also has to go into a horizontal position. A rammer pushes the round forward, and then you're ready to fire. Now, advantages and disadvantages. You can see one of the advantages. It means you've got rid of the height issue, so you can make your tanks lower. If you're a lower tank in terms of your height, your profile, harder to see and hit. Disadvantages, if that projectile cassette jams at all, you're in real trouble. Normally a human can actually get more rounds loaded and fired off quicker than even the best of the auto loaders today. And famously, there's footage of a mad minute of a Centurion down at Lulworth. It is gobsmacking how quickly a well-trained tank crew can load a round, and you're looking at about 3-4 counting seconds and another round goes off down range. So advantages and disadvantages of that doing the auto loader system. Now you're looking at that, the next tank moving off, this huge great M103. As I said earlier, this is one of those tanks that was designed at the time of the worry in the West in the 50s of the nervousness about bigger, heavier Soviet tanks like the T-10. And the worry was the standard tanks going into service, the Patton family of tanks as they were called, may not be up to it. And certainly in Britain we were worried about our Centurions with the 20-pounder gun on. So in Britain we made the Conqueror, in America we made the M103. Got rid of by the American Army and handed over to the US Marines, and actually that tank that's driving there is in US Marine Corps marking. And some years ago we had an American Marine retired guy came over, said that was my tank. Put it bluntly, we hear that an awful lot at the museum here, that was my tank, I served in that one, and quite often it was not their tank, it was one similar. And this guy actually took us to this tank and said, yeah, I left my graffiti inside it, and sure enough there was his name scratched inside the turret of that M103. So this time it definitely was his tank. Whopping great American 120mm gun on it, and you can just see the size of that, the casting there of that turret and that hull. And another thing to remember is, as we've got our French guests here today from the Semur, the museum at on the Loire Valley that the Panther comes from. In 1940, it was French engineers from Le Creusot that escaped with a number of French officers, were sent to America, and they helped teach the American engineers the art of casting large tank turrets and tank hulls. And so if you look at the very early hulls for the M3 Grant tank, they are almost identical in their casting technique and fixtures to the French Semur tank, because again it was the engineers there were teaching people how to do castings that big, and you can see how that skill set's moved on with that M103, a massive piece of casting. Same on the M60, the size of that great big cast turret there, and the boat shape, as it's often described, the hull, slightly rounded bottom to the hull on the M60, and again the idea there being is if you drove over a mine, the glass will be vented up the side of the vehicle and hopefully won't be captured directly under the vehicle. military program put on it, which means it's had tweaks to the engine, and you can see it's got that searchlight on the top of the barrel, white light searchlight there, and this particular camouflage scheme, it was in use with the American forces in Europe, with the NATO forces in the 1980s and early 90s. So this particular M60, it's being crewed at the moment by a team of guys that have come over from Austria. They are people that work at the Austrian Military Museum that's in the middle of Vienna. Fantastic collection of vehicles they've got, and a lot of the guys there have served on M60 till fairly recently, so they've been helping us tweak that vehicle, get it into good running order, and it gives them the excuse every now and again to fly over and give it a drive like today. At the moment, again, we've actually got a vehicle out on loan. We've got a Grizzly on loan to the museum out in Vienna. So if you happen to be walking past there, pop in, say hello and have a look at our Grizzly. So that's the M60 moving off. Now the tank with its gun reversed in the middle of the arena is the Chieftain. And the Chieftain, of course, was a successor to the Centurion that looks like it's having a little bit of engine trouble sitting in the corner there. The big difference here, you can see we've got that mantlet-less turret. In other words, look at the front of the turret. It almost goes to a needle point, and that's holding that huge 120mm gun. You've got very thick cast armour, and on this later model, models 10 and 11 of the Chieftain, they add Stillbrew armour. So we were worried about the bigger, more impressive Soviet 125mm gun, so we add some even more armour. The Stillbrew armour, it's basically cast armour with some rubber inserts before it actually is welded or bolted onto the front turret. It's meant to be. Armour protection was, you know, better than pretty much anything out there at the time. Engine was the problem. The L60 engine had a lot of trouble in its service life. In terms of gunnery, that 120 gun, it's the first time they're starting to use a muzzle reference system. So at the end of the barrel there, you might see there's a little black cap on the end of the barrel. Under that cap is a small mirror, and a light can be shone from above the turret to the mirror, bounces back inside, and a measuring device can actually work out if that long barrel has got any droop or bend. And the whole issue there is, with that extra long gun firing, even though it's got insulation, you can see the canvas cover on the barrel. Even then, if it's firing on a day when there might be a cold wind blowing over one side of the barrel, if that causes the metal to shrink at all, the barrel of that length may have a millimetre or so difference from one end to the other, and you're going to miss your target at a range of, say, 2 kilometres. So by that muzzle reference system, they can make sure that before the gun fires, any droop or bend in the barrel is adjusted for, which meant that was a tremendously accurate gun. And in fact, that gun and the weapon system really is exactly the same on the next tanks in the arena there, the Challenger 1. Now, Challenger 1 is a tank that was really being designed for the Shah of Iran. He ordered 3 different types of tanks off of Britain. One was pretty much a souped-up Chieftain. Another was called Shear 1 and Shear, and then we had Shear 2. And really what happened when the Shah was disposed from power in 1978, the tanks were just going into production at Leeds, and the British program NBT-80 to make a replacement for Chieftain, it was having issues. It was a bit behind the curve. Lots of clever things had been learned, but they hadn't really got to find the tank design yet. So the obvious thing the British government was to do was to so the tank went into the British service with a number of tweaks as a Challenger 1. So really what you're looking at there is gunnery is exactly the same as on Chieftain, but it's got the new Chobham armour, which is that British laminate armour. Is still officially secret, but it's basically made up of layers of other materials, including ceramics, in a very clever sort of system that's mounted under the skin of the vehicle. You're looking at an outer skin there, and underneath are the armour packs, and that has tremendous stopping power in terms of for armour-piercing, fin-stabilised rounds, for RPGs, all sorts of things. That is very well protected. And the difference in the back, you've now onto a CV90 engine. You're looking now at a very powerful diesel engine as opposed to the multi-fuel L60 engine. A lot of criticisms of the vehicle initially, but it didn't do well in a gunnery competition, but when it went off to fight in the Gulf War, did the business. And at the end of it, Cordingley, who was the guy in charge of the British Army at the time, was very pleased with how Challenger 1 performed. And tomorrow, if you'll be about, you'll be able to see its successor, which is the British Army's Challenger 2. Now, it looks like we're going to recover or have a look at recovering the Centurion, and I'll just find out for you if we're going to